5:48. Got a confession? You can send it to confessions@greatesthitsradio.co.uk. That's working nicely. Just noticed a 3-worder from Steve Rogers. Munchline is engaged.
Oh, come
A
on.
reference to last week. Of course, if you miss any confession, you can always go back via the app and you can look, you look for Simon Mayo's podcast daily. Is that right?
Simon Mayo's Daily Confession podcast.
Okay, it has that. I don't know why I can't remember that. Title's very straightforward.
Yeah, it is really.
Okay. I've lost my pen. I can't speak without my pen, but I'm going to carry on regardless. No, I don't need that pen. I need
Your own special pen. Oh, my goodness.
Today's confession comes from Chris, who has a bit of a period number, this one. Chris says, my confession starts in the early 1980s, Father Simon. And we were working at Manton Colliery in Nottinghamshire. Now, the next bit I don't quite understand, it doesn't matter though, on PO1's tailgate. Okay? Here's the crucial bit you need to know. The hottest place on earth.
Okay.
Okay. Working in Manton Colliery in Bassetlaw. This place was so hot, we only wore a pair of underpants while we were working. Long-standing listeners will remember other confessions which have started in a similar manner. During a breakdown and having an hour, as in a mining breakdown, rather.
Got it.
And having an hour to kill before the end of our shift, we decided to entertain ourselves. Excuse me, not much to do really when you're working down a mine in your underpants. So we decided, as you would, to have a samurai fight.
Of course, yeah.
Using rolled up paper sacks for swords. I mean, this would seem to be a sensible thing to do. We would stand in front of our opponent and bow, and then let loose like demented rabbits at each other, the onlooking co-workers deciding the winner. See, this is lost. You see, lost to posterity, this kind of pastime. One young buck and an old miner stood face to face, bowed, and then attacked each other. After a flurry of blows, the old miner was getting the upper hand, so I stopped the contest with urgency, telling the young buck he had a cut above his left eye. Actually, it was no more than a paper cut, to be perfectly honest, but it was there. As he raised his finger to investigate, I grabbed his hand to stop him. Don't touch it, fool, it's deep. You don't want to get coal dust in it. Because as a well-known fact, Father Simon, we all knew that a cut which got coal dust in would scar you for life.
Okay.
Well, how big is the cut? This guy inquired. It's about 2 inches in length and very, very deep, I replied. And just at that moment, a small, tiny bead of sweat and blood mingled together on his forehead. I carefully gathered this red stuff on the end of my finger to strengthen my ruse. Look, I said, look at this. Upon seeing the blood, he became quite agitated. The colour drained from his face. The deputy was called to perform first aid. He'd been tipped the wink, so he went along with the charade. The biggest bandage was taken from the box and applied to this guy's head. This bandage was so big it had a pad bigger than a baby's nappy.
Okay.
His helmet had the innards removed, so it can now sit on top of his impromptu turban. We proceeded out of the mine with the lad telling everyone that he had a big gash on his forehead. I've got a big gash on my forehead, he said quite a lot. When we arrived at the shaft, he was escorted to the front to ride first, as this was the way we did it with casualties. Upon reaching daylight, he proceeded to the medical room where the attendant was seeing to another casualty. Upon seeing a head injury, the medical attendant turfed the poor guy out of the chair. This is the guy with the genuine injury. Turfed him out of his seat and proceeded to treat Gasher, as we were calling him. After unwrapping the bandage, the attendant stood, looked at Gasher the way headmasters look at stupid boys, and then proclaimed, "Son, I think you've been had." Now, we were all in the showers as this voice boomed, "You bunch of absolute, shall we say, rotters?"
Rotters, yeah.
The whole place was in hysterics, and his name forevermore, in true pit tradition, was Gasher. I haven't changed this nickname, by the way. That's what it says.
Good.
Okay,
Right.
Now, I do not beg forgiveness from Gasher, but from the poor chap, whoever he was, that had his medical treatment so cruelly interrupted when he was turfed out of the chair. And Chris signs this, once a miner, always a miner. So we don't actually get very many mining pastimes, though we have had miners in their underpants before.
Yes.
Visited by Prince Charles.
Yes, yeah, that is right.
As I recall. Anyway, this one just concerns Manton Colliery in Notts. And poor Gasher, who was made to look a fool. Sister Holly, what do you say to this?
Yeah, not forgiving, really. Touching his blood is just a bit gross. Like, that just grossed me out, really.
That was the only bit that grossed?
That was a bit ew.
Touching his blood?
Yeah, like when he touched his blood off the paper cut that above his...
Yes.
On his head. Didn't like that. Also, the thought of them being in their underpants. It's all just a bit gross for me, really. A bit unsavoury at this time. And didn't like it, so no, not forgiving. And also the poor chap that was turfed out of his chair. Get out the chair. We've got someone with a really serious injury, and it was just a paper cut all along. So no forgiveness here.
She's getting a little bit worked up.
Disapproving of the blood and the pants. I'm going to forgive. I mean, ultimately, your man who got turfed out of the seat, he probably got straight back in, didn't he? Let's be honest.
Yes.
Because he was very quick. He unwrapped the thing. Oh, it was just a paper cut. And probably, actually, the paper cut was probably a good idea to have it wrapped up because, you know, it's still blood and coal dust, as we've found out. So, and who knew that rabbits can fight like samurai? I didn't know that, but we've all learned something.
He's got no idea what he's talking about at this
laughing and learning today. Laughing and learning. So, for that reason, I'm going to forgive.
Remember, if you find yourself stuck down a mine, you can always pretend to be a samurai.
Yeah.
That's what we've learned. Okay, so it's divided in the studio. So it's the people's verdict. Do you forgive Chris, yes or no? Tonight's confession came from Chris, and it was a memory from the Manton Colliery in Notts, where they're all in underpants, and Gasher was told he had a very deep cut on his head because they'd been playing like mock samurai fight, but actually he was just being made fun of, but some guy lost his medical treatment. It's all that kind. That's where we are. It's the early 80s. This stuff happened, and the people's verdict is in, and Matt has collected it.
Everyone forgives tonight. Danny in Redbridge says, we never found out what happened to the genuinely injured man, so I guess it was nothing serious. It's all a bit of fun. No use crying over spilt blood. Josh says, hey, Drive Time Gang.
Hey.
I think I will forgive. I completely agree with Matt. He's normally right. Lol. No harm done, and he stopped his little scratch getting worse. Sounds like good friendship from his work colleagues. And John says, definitely forgive Chris and Gasher, but not Holly today. My dad worked for 47 years in Mountain Ash Colliery, and practical jokes were par for the course. She's lucky they were wearing pants, as being underground, the temperature was constantly in the 20s.
There you go. So, as high as the 20s. So, anyway, we would like more confessions, please. And if that's maybe sparked a thought in your head, send it to us. confessions@greatesthitsradio.co.uk. If you miss a confession, you can always go via the app and check out the feature which is called
Simon Mayo's Daily Confession Podcast.
So easy, really.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a pretty straightforward title.
There is never any excuse for not checking out a confession. If you want to catch up, that's where you go. What's it called again?
Simon Mayo's Daily Confession Podcast.
That's the one. Today's confession comes from Spud. Thank you, Spud. It says, hi, team. Slightly casual, I think. Mm-hmm. Many moons ago, late 70s, I was in the RAF regiment and based at a well-known station. I've taken out a large chunk of that sentence. I also had a mate, ish, called Wilf. I say ish because Wilf would always play pranks, which, though were very funny to most, were not to the person who was pranked. He did one on me by putting a fuel lever, which was just to the front of the passenger seat, in the Land Rover I'd parked up, to its central position. Land Rovers in those days had 2 fuel tanks, one under each seat. So the lever either pointed to the left or the right for whichever tank was in use. If it was central, then no fuel got to the engine. So Muggins here, along with 5 others, got back into the Land Rover after doing the job we were on and proceeded to start the engine, except it wouldn't start. It took me and my 5 comrades 45 minutes to figure out why the engine wouldn't start, and as a consequence, we missed our dinner.
Oh.
This is a very shocking thing. Can you imagine my glee when driving around one of the hangars to park up? I noticed Wilf getting out of a Land Rover. He had just parked up and walking to the hangar without the keys and paperwork, which meant that he would be using the vehicle again. Revenge was due. I have to say there are a few references in this next section. I don't quite fully understand the RAF terminology, but we get the general drift, I think. So I drew my vehicle up next to his so that I may do exactly to him as he had done to me. Do as you would be done by, I believe is the saying. Because our vehicles were facing opposite directions, I went into Will's vehicle by the driver's side and so had to lean over the seats to get to the passenger side. In the process, I had to move the gear stick as it dug into my side before moving the fuel lever to the centre. Feeling rather pleased with myself, I got back into my vehicle and started the engine so that I could park up and possibly watch Wilf from afar. But then, catastrophe. Wilf's car started rolling backwards. Remember, he's not in it. It's rolling backwards without him. Dread filled my being as I froze for a split second, watching the Land Rover slowly moving towards the aircraft pan. Don't know what that is.
Okay.
No.
But obviously it's important.
Yeah.
Luckily there were no aircraft, but there were a few mobile generators waiting for the aircraft to return, and a couple of RAF technicians with them. I decided to take off in my car after the rolling Land Rover with the intention of getting ahead of it, so that it would then go into the back of my vehicle and therefore stop before it got into the pan.
The pan, yeah.
Unfortunately, these were the days before steering locks, and before I had managed to get past the Land Rover, the vehicle must have hit a different level of concrete, which caused the steering wheel to suddenly turn and head directly for one of the technicians. It also careered into the side of my vehicle, so I had a fight on my hands. I sounded the horn continuously to warn the technicians, who had ear defenders on. It was heading their way. I also deduced that the Land Rover would be better hitting a generator rather than picking up speed and going on a merry journey of destruction throughout the station beyond the aircraft pan. Whatever that is. So I began to fight to guide it towards an intended target. The technicians quickly bomb burst when they saw what was going on. I imagine that just meant
Run away.
Ran as fast as they possibly could. Luckily, the force of my vehicle pushing Will's vehicle from the side seemed to slow his vehicle a little, so that when the Land Rover hit the generator, I had just enough time to take evading action and come to a stop. As I sat there, shaking and in sweat and no doubt white as a sheet, I saw my entire career vanish before my eyes. That was until I came out of my panic state and remembered what my sergeant had told me several months earlier. If you're going to lie, boy, make sure it's the truth. So I did, by totally missing out the bit about the fuel lever and the gear stick. I might have also told a little lie when I said I was only thinking about the lives of the technicians, but hey, who's counting? Well, to cut a long story short, Father Simon, Wilf ended up doing 4 weeks of extra duties in the cookhouse for leaving his vehicle in an unsafe condition, and I got a hefty pat on the back for reacting decisively to save lives.
Yeah.
Either way, on his march into the office before the commanding officer after being charged, Wilf had to thank me for my endeavours after I had given evidence. It was one of the hardest things I've had to do in my life, looking into Wilf's eyes without laughing, whilst he gave a sincere thanks and an apology to me in the hope that his sentence would be lenient. I therefore seek forgiveness, please, not from Wilf. He deserved every dirty pan that he was forced to scrub. And how was I to know that he had the habit of not applying the handbrake and just leaving the vehicle in gear? But from the other guy, the 5 guys that missed their dinner because I should have worked out what was wrong with the lever in the first place. And from the poor technicians who must have had the fright of their lives. Which is true, because they did that bomb burst. Just
The bomb burst, yeah.
Run very, very fast indeed. Anyway, it's an RAF tale involving the aircraft pan, but whatever that is. But also, most importantly, no one was hurt,
Yes.
but Spud got his own back on Wilf. I have to say, Sister Holly is already looking stern and unforgiving.
Yeah, not too happy about this one. I totally understand why Spud was annoyed, because the whole pranking thing I do find really immature and a bit silly. And so I understand that. However, an eye for an eye, it just isn't a good way to do things. Going about it revenge, that's bad. And then it just turned into absolute carnage. People could have gotten very, very hurt, and it was just very dangerous. So really, all in all, shouldn't have been done. And then you lied to his face. And because he thanked you. I thought that was bad. So no, not forgiving here.
Okay. I mean, I think that's a little harsh myself, you know, really. But once Holly's on a moral roll,
Quite right.
you can't stop her. But brother from another...
I mean, let's not forget, this could have been far worse. No one was hurt. Everything was fine in the end of it. And Wilf didn't surely learn the lesson that the hunter had become the hunted after his pranks, and it all blew up in his face. And also should have applied the handbrake. All of this could have been avoided, Wilf, if you knew where the handbrake was, and you didn't. So looks like you've learned a lesson too, sunshine. So yes, definitely forgiven.
Okay, all right, so to no one's great surprise, it's 1-1 in the studio, which means it's entirely down to you, the people's verdict. Do you forgive Spud? Yes or no? On the text 61054, first word is Simon. Just before the news, we had a little confession from Spud concerning his mate Wilf, who was a prankster who didn't put his brake on in his Land Rover. So Spud deliberately knocks its gear stick and the old car rolls until it hits a generator, avoiding the aircraft pan.
Yes.
Maybe.
Good news.
Which is a very good thing. Anyway, the people's verdict is here.
So Patsy in Margate says, forgiven. Wilf should have been punished. He did leave the vehicle in an unsafe condition by leaving with the handbrake off. Johnny says, not forgiven. Doing a silly prank like that with all those people and aircrafts around was a daft idea. No forgiveness, I'm afraid. But Aidan Badsley says, forgiven. As a Land Rover owner myself, I can only sympathise with the young chap. When leaning across the seats, the handbrake does dig in when you don't want it to, and he probably thought it was the gear stick.
Oh, okay. Well, that's like inside information that we had in that last one. Okay, so if you have a confession for us, you know what you have to do. You send it to confessions@greatesthitsradio.co.uk. It's 5:46. Hello, well, good afternoon, good evening. This is Greatest Hits Radio. Proud to do another confession. Wednesday's confession, another smart speaker to give away. Don't forget, if you ever miss out on a confession, you can go via the app and you can check out the app, the confession on a daily basis. And you go to
Simon Mayo's Daily Confession Podcast.
So easy, that really.
That's what you do. Very easy.
Just rolls off the tongue.
It's the daily confessional update sequence.
Oh dear.
That's what you're looking for. Today's Certificate 12, reprehensible behaviour, comes from Nigel. You'll see what I'm talking about. Father Simon and the Exceptionally Forgiving Collective. This time of year, I think about those young souls leaving home for the first time and starting on their journey into adulthood by attending our esteemed educational colleges of various types, the places where maturity and integrity are forged with learning to produce doctors, architects, disc jockeys, and in this particular instance...
Yeah, no, they definitely belong in that company.
You can study disc jockey life. And in this particular instance, teachers. The 1960s and 1970s, there was a well-respected college which turned out thousands of teachers for primary schools across the UK and many other countries too. Many of your listeners would have been taught by one or more of its alumni. It is normal to name the place where the sin occurred, but I must refrain, as its successor institution is still producing teachers. At the beginning of each academic year, rituals and ceremonies take place to initiate new students into the hallowed ways of their college's student body. This particular college had numerous initiations for the first-year students, and the one to which I refer was often called the Canadian log trick. It went through many iterations, but they all broadly followed the same pattern. Can I just say at this point that initiation ceremonies are universally regarded as pathetic.
Correct.
Yes.
And have no place at all in an enlightened establishment. However, it's included here because the Canadian log trick, I think, is based on an old party game which I remember from a book called The Complete Home Entertainer, which my parents had. So I think, so basically this is a party game which is being dressed up as an initiation ceremony. That's it. End of the editorial.
Yeah.
Back to Nigel. One night during Freshers' Week, Father Simon, the fire alarm would ring, usually about 1 or 2 o'clock, when the new students were tucked up in their beds. Imagine their panic, Father Simon, when the noisy fire alarm sounded, doors were banged to make sure everyone was awake, and the thud-thud of heavy-footed men rushing out of the building. A roll call checked that all the freshers were out the building and standing in their pyjamas, cold and disorientated. A second or third-year student would then shout, "All present, let's do the Canadian log trick." Shock and horror on the faces of the freshers, glee, laughter and excitement on the second and third year students. The important thing to know about this particular hall of residence is that it was originally built as a very grand 3-story hotel and had a magnificent central atrium and stairwell. From the ground you could look up the full 3 stories to the ceiling and admire the grand staircase and its balustrade winding its way around the edge of the stairwell. This stairwell was about 5 to 6 meters across. These were the pre-health and safety days, so there was nothing to stop you falling over the rail should you be so stupid as to lean over too far. One of the third-year PE students would take charge of the group of freshers and march them to the 4th floor, put them into an empty room and then close the door. 2 things to note. Firstly, as they reached the top of the stairwell, they would see a plank bridging the well from one side to another. This obviously caused concerned mutterings as to its purpose. The second thing to note is that it was always PE students who took the lead in the Freshers' Week initiation rituals.
Ugh,
Yeah.
PE.
We knew that they were PE students because with help they could spell their chosen subject. Those who can do, those who can't teach, and those who can't teach gym.
Correct.
The PE School of Rock, of course. The PE students would then decide who was going to do the trick. The ringleader would unlock the door and call out the victim. Oi, Twinkle Toes, over here. The by now quivering wreck would be dragged out of the room and made to stand next to the balustrade and the plank. This is the Canadian log trick. All you have to do is to walk from this side to the other on the plank. It's simple, except you've got a blindfold on. They all went a little bit London when they were explaining this. As they put the blindfold onto Twinkle Toes, the plank would be removed from the top of the handrail and placed very quietly down on the floor. They would then pretend to lift Twinkle Toes onto the plank, which was now on the floor, but they didn't know that.
Yeah.
Don't fall, mind the gaps, long way down, because they're all from London.
Yeah, they are.
They shouted as Twinkle Toes tentatively made his way along the plank, gently sliding each foot in turn. More often than not, the fresher would lose his balance, scream and fall as he dropped 2 inches to the floor. 5 to 8 centimetres for younger listeners.
Yeah.
Massive burst of cheering and laughter ensued. Now, the rest of the freshers were then let out of the room to see what had just happened, all of them laughing and joking to humour the PE students and quietly thanking their own God that they hadn't been picked. This jolly jape died out by the late 70s, thank heavens for that, so most of those involved have or are about to retire from teaching and head teacher roles. Some, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, may even have become school inspectors. I think Nigel knows of what he writes
really?
here. Father Simon, I beg for forgiveness, not for those who inflicted such terror on their fellow students, as many of those would go back as second and third year students to continue the initiation ceremonies themselves. I beg for those who, as teachers, would admonish and punish children in their classes and schools for doing the most trivial of wrongs when they forced a poor innocent first year to perform the Canadian log trick, which hopefully, as Nigel has said, disappeared in the 1970s because we don't approve of this kind of thing. But anyway, yes, all the people who took part in that are now in very eminent roles and maybe about to retire. But let's see what a very, very stern-faced Sister Holly makes of that.
Everything about this I hate. I don't like initiations. Sick and wrong. I hate them. The fact that it was the PE students as well. Oh, just typical. Waking them up in the middle of the night.
Wrong.
I'd be so grumpy about that with the fire alarm. And then
believe that.
forcing them to go on this plank. Oh, the Canadian log trick. Who enjoys watching people be really scared? Who
Me.
likes that? Don't understand. Didn't like it. Not forgiving at all.
A brother from another gutter.
I mean, I obviously would go along with Holly in that not a massive fan of initiation ceremonies. However, that said, this was very funny. I mean, it was objectively very funny to see people teetering along a little plank on the floor, thinking that if they made one misstep, they were falling to their doom. And I mean, that is just very funny. And so I'm going to forgive it. No harm done. Everyone was enjoying it, and everyone had to do it, apart from the ones who were still kept in the room. They didn't have to do it, but one of them did have to do it, and who'd have known? And character building, that was probably it. So yeah, for all those reasons, a little bit random now, going to forgive.
The party game version of it, I think, it was like a plank of wood with propped high on like 2 step ladders. Then you thought that you were walking along the plank, but you were blindfolded, and then they'd taken it away, so it was all fine and all dandy. However, 61054 is the text number. First word is Simon. Forgiveness for Nigel or not? Just before the news, we had a confession from Nigel. Teacher training initiation rites with the Canadian log trick, with occasionally hilarious moments. Obviously, we were disapproving, apart from Matt, who thought it was all good. But I did like the fact that all the people who took part and cheered were now head teachers and school inspectors, and probably retiring and thinking, do you know what? I vaguely remember the Canadian log trick. Anyway, the people's verdict is what we need, and here it comes.
So Michaela in Richmond is not forgiving. I am totally with Sister Holly on this one, she says. Anything which involves rudely awakening people in the middle of the night is just awful. But Debbie says absolutely forgiven. Part of the passage of life. No sticker for just taking part. Whoever did the challenge took one for the team. And Rachel says in the late 70s, it definitely was still doing the around, it was worse. I remember the trick being played by the teachers on several of my classmates on a residential trip to Lowestoft. Different times, thankfully, but Nigel is not forgiven.
All right, okay. Your confession, please. Confessions at greatesthitsradio.co.uk. We're about to enter confessional territory. Don't forget, if you miss any confession, there is no reason to actually miss it completely, but if you miss it when it goes out live, you can always catch up via the app. I think it's labelled the Daily Confessions podcast.
No.
Simon Mayo's Daily Confession podcast.
I was close.
Yeah.
Okay, very, very close. I'll be there very shortly. Here is today's. Now, we're in familiar territory for most of this confession, but it has a kind of an unexpected kind of a twist at the end.
Ooh.
Comes from Maggie, Simon and the team. Oh, thank you very much.
No, not him.
I appeal today to the Confessional Collective to forgive my actions. Holly might even forgive this one.
Ooh.
That's your reputation.
Yeah.
Wow.
Right there. My story is set in Glasgow in the 60s when I was just 16 years old. I had dated a guy called John McConey a couple of times. We happened to be members of the same youth club. John's mother worked in the local newsagents, so my mum and grandmother got to know Mrs. McConey quite well, if only in her capacity of newspaper sales lady. Sadly, Mrs. M had a heart condition and she suddenly died. Now, my mum and I decided that we would go to the funeral. It would be the first time I had ever gone to a funeral. The crematorium was 2 bus rides away across town. I don't know about today, but back then bus companies hadn't even heard of a timetable. So the journey seemed to take forever, and we arrived at the crematorium just in time, which, as you can imagine, was a great relief. The problem was that this crematorium had lots of little chapels dotted about. We had no idea which one was allocated to the McConey family. As we stared at groups of solemn people, wondering which one was for Mrs. M, my mother suddenly grabbed my arm and said, "Here we are, this one," because she recognised another of the newsagent's employees. So we managed to get through the door of the chapel just before they were closed, and an undertaker quickly stepped forward and ushered us into seats in the front row.
Wow.
By this time, I just wanted it all to be over. I had no idea that funerals were so harrowing. Maybe I should have thought of that a little bit before I went. Then the vicar stood up and said, "We are gathered here today."
Oh, yes, Derek Nimmo.
We are
everyone.
gathered here today to bid farewell to Brian.
Oh.
Brian? What happened to Mrs. McConey? I turned to look at my mother. She later said my eyes were like saucers. No wonder. What could we do? You can't just leave a funeral. We couldn't stand up and say, "Sorry, wrong dead person." So we had to stay there all the way through, standing up for the hymns and sitting down for the prayers. I mean, that's what tends to happen. The lot. We had to stay for the whole thing. I could feel the eyes of the poor relatives and friends burrowing into the back of my head, wondering who we were. Eventually, the whole desperate service came to an end, and my mother and I shot out of the chapel, straight into John, who was standing outside waiting for his mum's funeral to begin in the chapel next door, which is where we should have gone. Actually, we ended up going to 2 funerals in one day. But now this had unintended consequences. I need to ask forgiveness, not for my mother, who convinced me that she knew which chapel to go to, or for, in quotes, recognising people who had never been near the newsagents, or indeed for me, really being a stressed-out teenager. But I need to ask for forgiveness for dead Brian's family and friends, who, so I now understand, wondered for years who the blonde mother and daughter were who turned up. My mother and I were very alike, and it was obvious I was her daughter. Brian appeared to have a secret double life. A secret daughter? What's going on? And then we rushed out. You never know, do you? By appearing at the wrong funeral, tongues had started to wag and would continue to wag for many decades. We are sorry and seek forgiveness. We are not Brian's secret family, just sloppy in our timekeeping. My only saving grace is that I hope George...
Not George. Definitely not George.
My only saving grace is that I hope Brian was looking down at the scene, unfolding in the chapel, and having a right good laugh. Okay, kind regards from Karen. I mean Maggie. Okay.
Oh dear.
Well, it was the 60s. I mean, so I think we're...
I think we're okay.
I think we're okay.
We all heard Brian.
Now, we've had confessions before about ending up at the wrong funeral, but this one had consequences which lasted and echoed through the generations. Sister Holly, are you going to forgive this one?
And yeah, that precisely that point really is why I'm not going to forgive. This ruined the poor chap's reputation for many, many decades. Poor Brian never had a secret family. Also, why would you sit in the front row? I know they were ushered into the front row, but surely you would make an excuse. Oh no, I really need to sit at the back. I hate sitting in the front row, so I can totally understand, but no, not forgiving here at all.
Only just occurred to me that Sister Holly sounds like a young Theresa May.
Oh, there's something to aim for. Great.
Wow.
Yeah,
You're so mean.
Look forward to that.
Okay. Brother Matthew.
I think this brought a little bit of intrigue to the funeral. I mean, funeral obviously very, very solemn occasions, but you want a bit of pizzazz in there, and the very idea that with those two people and what's going on there?
Blonde mother, blonde
You
daughter.
blown
What is
what
going on,
earth?
Brian?
Oh, I say.
Keith?
Bit of a dark horse, Brian. Stroke George. So I think, they're putting the fun in funeral. So yes, for that reason, I'm going to forgive.
Putting the fun in funeral, something
Absolutely.
which no one has ever asked for, ever. Okay, well, that's very good. Maggie, it's Maggie's confession. Does she get your forgiveness? That's the thing. Do you forgive Maggie for a funeral faux pas? People's verdict, here it comes.
So everyone's forgiving tonight. Michaela, so hilarious. The thought of turning up to the wrong funeral is mortifying. Matt says there's nothing worse than being in the front row, particularly for a funeral. Poor Maggie. And Patrick in Cumberland says, I don't think it's Maggie's fault that Brian's family assumed he was playing away. Sitting quietly and shuffling out was the best thing they could have done, in my opinion.
If you have a confession, whether it's a funeral confession or not, send it to confessions@greatesthitsradio.co.uk.